One of the many wonderful things that Mattress Stitch can help you with is to put seams between fabrics that don't have the same gauge. So on this particular project, which is a blanket, it's made up of sections which are stranded knitting and have yarns carried at the back, and areas that are stocking stitch. And the idea is that when we join it all together, it will become a checkerboard. This project was knit in the round with panels of the stranded knitting side by side, and then areas of stocking stitch. Then, in between the various different areas of the knitting, there were steeks made, seam allowances. And so once the piece was finished, it's been cut apart, and now all we have to do is seam it together using Mattress Stitch. However, we've got distinctly different numbers of rows. So on this side, I've just counted it, and I've got 70 rounds or rows of stocking stitch, because this was knit on a smaller needle to stop it puffing out, to match up to 54 rounds of stranded knitting. So in other words, I've got a 16 round difference in the next 6 inches. So I've got to use up 16 extra rows on this side as I work. In order to get rid of the 16 extra rows, if I divide 54 rows by 16, I come up with 3.8. So every 3.8 rounds of this, I have to use an additional round on this side. So that is mostly every 4 rounds, and occasionally every 3 rounds, and then I can fine-tune it as I get closer to the corner point. Before I begin, I'm just going to remove my marker yarns. These are what I call running yarn markers. They were used to indicate where the steek was, and you can see in stocking stitch you really don't have any way when you're knitting of knowing where the steek is unless you have a marker yarn in there. This piece of knitting has been washed and dried, and so you can see that the marker does leave us a faint line here, which will help us when it comes to staying on track. So I'm going to go under 1 bar. I still have a coloured bar from the last section to do. And then come into this side, and 1 bar where there's 2 colour knitting actually is 2 pieces of yarn. You might not necessarily always get the second piece of yarn, but just don't try and treat them as separate rows or rounds. So I've done 1, 2. So this is number 2 on this side. Number 3, and there you can quite clearly see the 2 rungs that form that round. And now I'm going under 2 bars on this side. 1 bar, 2 bars. So I have now got rid of 1 of my 16 extra rounds. 1, 2. I'm starting just to gather this up a little bit, but not so tight that I can't see where I'm going. And you don't want it to be fiercely tight, otherwise there's a lot of stress on the sewing yarn. 3. If you're doing something where you have a ratio to adhere to, you want to take the phone off the hook and concentrate. So, okay, I think it's time for a double rung on this side. So I'm going to carry on with this. My seam is coming along quite nicely now, and I'm about to run out of sewing yarn. I like to keep my sewing yarn short because the wool will wear out. Knitting yarn wasn't designed to be sewn with. So what I'm doing is copying what I last did on this side, which was actually a double rung, and I'm leaving my tail on the right side. I leave them loose on the front of the fabric because if I were to get to the top of this sewing area and find I wasn't happy with my join, I can just pull this out through the fabric without the need to unpick it. And that means you can be much more particular about your sewing. The prospect of unpicking mattress stitch is rather tedious. So I'm going back to my counting again. 1 on this side. And the important things with mattress stitch is that your needle is always pointing in the direction of sewing, so it doesn't turn around and go backwards. It's always pointing along in the direction of the seam. We're working from the right side, so we can see exactly what's going on. We don't need to keep changing colours because it will blend in and the actual sewing yarn will disappear from view. And you want to snuggle it up, but not too tight. If you pull it very tight, your edges of your fabric will wobble instead. We actually want the seam yarn to wobble, not the edges of the fabric. So I think it's about time I did another double here. Now I could put safety pins in and say to myself I need to do 4 before the first quarter, 8 before the half, and avoid the counting. Or I can go part way up and then check my row numbers to see how I'm getting along towards my goal. I'm being very careful to stay in the same column all the way on both sides, and that's what gives us a neat seam. I'm also not picking up any of the edge of the fabric. I'm just going under the rung of the ladder. And on the back of the work, that's what it should look like. And you can see here, in fact, I could turn this over and count how many times I've skipped 2 rungs, so I could assess my progress on this side. It's coming together really nicely. And I can see more or less by eye that I'm staying on track. I still have a few more to catch up, but they're remaining equal, so I'm keeping my eye on this. I have to say it is hard to count and talk at the same time. You can use the same method to equalize side seams if you accidentally have a couple of extra rows on the front of a fabric as compared to the back. If you start your side seams down at the lower edge of a garment, if there's any fudging to be done, you can get it done up near the underarm, just before you reach the armhole. So it's looking good. That's my last green round. And actually my next round on this side would be blue. So that's as close as we can get to matching that corner. And I'm happy with that. And I'll just continue on my way. Now that I've finished with this end and I'm not about to pull this out, I'll take these tails through to the private side and use them to over sew on the inside of the garment, just in case that yarn were ever to break, then it would only go as far as where we've darned the tails in. That's the wonder of mattress stitch.